Hello and welcome to the Manchester is Red podcast. My name is Steven Railston and we're recording this episode on a Monday afternoon, a day after United drew 0-0 with Aston Villa at Villa Park. Obviously that game was on Sunday evening or Sunday afternoon, the 2 p.m. kickoff. Samuel Luckhurst was at that game. He was joined by Tyrone Marshall, my colleague, and I was blogging the match from home. It's always no one wants to do that, do you, Sam? You always want to be at the game, but someone has to do it at the end of the day, and I was chosen. I'm here with you, and we're going to discuss Thomas Tuchel, actually, Sam, at the start of this podcast, because we were just laughing very briefly before we started recording. The game was a bit pants. It was a bit rubbish. 0-0, a goalless draw. Not much to talk about. But you've done the story this morning that Thomas Tuchel is being considered by United. I said on the last podcast that change is starting to feel inevitable for Erik Ten Hag. It's been an incredibly poor start to the season. So do you just want to flesh out that story and have the opportunity to discuss that a bit more?
Of course, unsurprisingly, a manager is esteemed as Tuchel and as well regarded as Tuchel, where he's attainable, where he's out of work, he's under consideration as a potential replacement for Erik Ten Hag. What I was told was that there are other managers that United like, but they're in employment at the moment, and they would, of course, be difficult to prize from their clubs and potentially expensive. And PSR does have a bearing on this as well as it did with their transfer window activity. If you're paying a manager compensation to the tune of something like £17.5 million or whatever it may be with Ten Hag, and then you're having to pay another fee to get a manager out of their contract at their club, that is going to have a bearing, or certainly have it's likely to force your hand as to whether you go with that manager or you have to look elsewhere. And of course, Tuchel is available. He met Sir Jim Ratcliffe earlier in the year. I was told that Ratcliffe's preferred choice in the summer was Tuchel, which would certainly account for the pair of them meeting in person, even though apparently Sir Jim Ratcliffe has absolutely no bearing on the decision-making process at Manchester United, if you can believe that at all. And it would be a real about turn, because that seemed like a very easy option for United in the close season to sack Ten Hag, who had a year left in his contract at that point, and bring Tuchel in. I think that would have been a logical move. It would have been an upgrade. I get that there are a lot of there are pros and cons with Tuchel, as there are with every coach, and that would still be the case if they were to go with Tuchel on this occasion. And I'm not saying for a single minute that it's definitely going to be Tuchel or a managerial changes in the immediate offing, but I've spoken quite recently about Dan Ashworth going on record in the past, and it's quite right what he said in that as a sporting director, if you're not prepared for a change of manager, if you're not prepared for a manager's sacking, then you're not doing your job properly. And the notion that United are just twiddling their thumbs and not eyeing up replacements for Erik Ten Hag is delusional. Of course, they're looking at potential replacements, and Tuchel is one of them.
He's a fascinating candidate, really, because obviously he has that proven Premier League record. He won the Champions League with Chelsea, but we've made this point on this podcast that his last spell of management at Bayern Munich, he crawled to the league title in 22-23 on the final day of the season. Obviously, Borussia Dortmund had a fantastic season. They bottled it on the final day, so Bayern won. And then his following season was a disaster. The wheels really started to fall off, and Tuchel departed. He's obviously been out of management since then. And you make the important point. I think a key thing in this is he is attainable. He is out of work, unlike some other managers who might be on their shortlist. Do you think he's a good fit for United? We've discussed how he talks about the club, and when he was in the Champions League, when he came to Old Trafford, he spoke very, very nicely about United, didn't he? Effusively, really, and he kind of sounded like he was angling for the job in the future. It does sound like a Man United manager, but his recent record hasn't been great. If you can't win the Bundesliga without Harry Kane, are you going to do very well with this United team?
Yeah, it's a completely valid point. His time at Bayern Munich was not a success, even though they did win the Bundesliga title. People in Munich would not regard that as success. For Bayern Munich, every season, the main objective has to be the Champions League, because they're one of the biggest clubs in Europe, and they do have they do have the quality in their squad to make that happen. I don't think they've necessarily got the quality in the dugout this season with Vincent Kompany in charge, but Tuchel's record. I mean, they got to the semi-finals last season. They were a little bit unlucky to lose to Real Madrid. They gave a good fist of it. There was a little bit of controversy towards the end of that second leg from memory. I mean, I remember watching that because there was a vested interest there in that if Bayern Munich won the Champions League and you'd have had them down as favourites had they got to the final against Borussia Dortmund, then that would automatically have increased Tuchel's chances of getting the United job, because by that point it was public knowledge that he was going to leave Bayern at the end of the season. He could have salvaged the season with a Champions League win. I don't think United would have turned their noses up at the prospect or the possibility of immediately hiring a coach who would have won 2 Champions Leagues, but that's a sliding doors moment. Bayern went out at the semi-finals, and Madrid went on and did what they often do and won the Champions League final. And you look at the Champions League win with Chelsea. Of course, that came during the COVID-19 pandemic, so I think that always you have to attach an asterisk to that. But he did preside over. Well, it's been 2 successive top 4 finishes. I think that Chelsea was, for much of my lifetime, it's always been seen as a player power club, certainly during the Abramovich era. With Tuchel, it felt like it was the other way around, that the power was more with the manager, especially with the way he dealt with Romelu Lukaku after he decided to inexplicably, pine for a return to Inter Milan about 6 months after leaving Italy. And Tuchel was very headstrong over that, and it was a real departure from the norm for Chelsea to actually back a manager over a player. And of course, times have changed, and Chelsea didn't have that dressing room leadership coterie that they had during Mourinho's heyday of Terry, Lampard, Drogba, Cech, etc. But it was still, quite a jolt to see Chelsea really backing a manager over a loudmouth player in Lukaku. And Chelsea did get to, I think they had 5 finals during Tuchel's time there. He was only there for something like 19 months. And I know, there's some irony there, because United have effectively become a cup team under Ten Hag, getting to 3 finals, winning 2 of them. They got to a quarter-final in the Europa League as well in his first season. So that's not what you want, but Tuchel did get Chelsea quite comfortably into the Champions League. And I think that's the key thing with United at the moment. Already, I mean, we all know it's a matter of when, not if, the manager is going to be, there's going to be a change of manager, because there has to be, because you look at the body of evidence and it's pretty staggering that Ten Hag is still in post. And the immediate objective has to be to get in the Champions League, because they are up against it with PSR. They are flirting with disaster there. Tuchel does have a track record of getting clubs into the Champions League, and he's got clubs in there into the Champions League who you automatically assume will be competing in the Champions League every season. It is a very different playing field now in England. In the early to late 2000s, it was the big 4. Then it was it was the top 4, because that never changed. Then Tottenham got in on the act. Then City bulldozed their way in. Then it became the big 6. Now it's almost like you have a big 3 again, because I don't think anyone's barging into the top 3 with Liverpool, City, and Arsenal there. And then you've got 5 clubs who are essentially just competing for one spot. So the competitiveness, the quality might not be at the level it's been in past Premier League campaigns, but the competitiveness is extraordinarily intense. And also with Ten Hag, even if United were to somehow sneak a top 4 finish under him, which I really don't think is going to happen this season, his record in the Champions League, apart from one season with Ajax where they were Lucas Moura kick away from getting to the final, which would have been an utterly extraordinary achievement, his track record is dreadful in the Champions League. I think it's 3 group stage eliminations and going out of the round of 16 to Benfica when Ajax were fancied. That 3rd group stage elimination being last year's with United. So given his contract length as well, is it worth persisting with a manager to get back in the Champions League, only to then possibly go out the group stage again? Because you look at his record, 5 campaigns in the Champions League, In 3 of them, his teams have gone out of the group stage, and then that's his last year of his contract. And that's very hypothetical, I know, and we know that's never going to happen because I don't think Ten Hag is going to be seeing out the season at United. But that's just another reason why they've got to get someone in who you look at them and you think, okay, he's going to get results immediately. He's
Do you think they're compromising their beliefs then, Samuel? Because when I
I
think of
think they are.
Ineos in a new football structure, I think they want to be more long-term builders, a more of a patient approach. We've heard of their kind of emphasis on youth, and Ratcliffe discussed that during his time at Nice and how much they want to embed the academy players, etc., and kind of spot the stars of the future. That's kind of the policy that we thought United want to take. And Tuchel contradicts that, doesn't he? Because he is a short-term appointment. But having said that, when the stakes are so high and they've been out the Champions League and they're risking being out of the Champions League for a second season in a row, do you think they're thinking, well, he might be the imperfect solution, but it's still better than where we are right now?
I think he ticks more boxes than he doesn't tick, in that he is a winner, he is demanding, he's got a good track record, he's got big club pedigree. He does promote young players as well. I think in the last final Chelsea played under Tuchel, he'd have had Mason Mount starting, he'd have had Reece James starting, and it might have even been Nathaniel Chalobah. I think might have started that cup final against Liverpool, where they ended up losing on penalties. They lost both the domestic cup finals that year to Liverpool on penalty shootouts. So he ticks the youth box as well, and so that in essence sounds good. But of course, at Dortmund, he was there for 2 years. He was at PSG for 2.5 years, I think it was. Chelsea 19 months, Bayern
And
Munich
the
18 months.
supposed clashes with the hierarchies as well. That's been mentioned.
Yeah,
with
he's
Tuchel
he's a truculent individual. He's combustible. United, certainly when they had Solskjaer there, and when it came to who they're going to get in to replace him, there were certain options. Who, I mean, Antonio Conte obviously was looking to get in on the act there at United, but there was no way United were ever going to go down that route, because that's just not what they wanted. They did not want someone confrontational. They wanted someone who's going to really conform to the way they were operating, and they had that with Solskjaer for nearly 3 years. They wouldn't have that with Tuchel, but it does help, despite what Ratcliffe said to the BBC on Friday, it does help that Tuchel has had FaceTime with him. And it is an issue that he had that FaceTime with him in May or June, whenever it was, and then United didn't follow through with it, and it wasn't quite right for both parties. Things have, of course, changed, and maybe Tuchel would be more amenable to coming in now, but it's not ideal, however way you look at it. But United need to be in the Champions League. It is of paramount importance they get in there, and they are fortunate that they have 2 routes into it this season, with the Europa League as well. And as you said the other week, going through the teams who are in the Europa League, it is a really poor competition. I think the Europa League is probably going to suffer from this new format, because I didn't agree with it, but when Champions League teams dropped into it, it did raise the level, and there were certain teams who, I imagine, there must have been a year where Sevilla won the Europa League, having dropped into it from the Champions League, having failed to qualify for the knockout rounds. But you don't have that anymore. The however many teams are in it, is it 32 or something like that? Those are the only teams you could draw. And when you're talking about United and Tottenham being joint favourites, and as brilliant as Tottenham were at Old Trafford, look at them yesterday. And then you're talking about Roma, who sacked their coach recently, Eintracht Frankfurt, who are in the mix just because they won it a couple of years ago, Athletic Bilbao, probably because their stadium will host the final. If United are coached properly, well drilled and on it, they should be winning that competition. And then you're back in the Champions League. If they're just on it in every Europa League game, they should win it. I don't think they'll win it with Erik ten Hag in charge. And I suspect he won't get the opportunity to take them into the knockout phase of it. But with Tuchel, I think their odds would probably shorten if they got Tuchel in, or a manager with a similar CV. But it's not ideal. And again, we go back to the summer, and it was a clear cock up to keep Ten Hag, because even if they wanted to go with Kieran McKenna, I think, although he's as relatively inexperienced as he is, I think they could have sold it to United fans that this is long term. We're going to be patient. We're going to get a set style of play. We're going to sign players objectively. This is the new way of thinking. I think a lot of you, and the way McKenna gets his teams playing and the patience he could have from United supporters. I think there was an easy way to sell that to United fans, even though they'd have been getting the manager from Ipswich Town, which in essence would have clearly startled a lot of fans as well. But that decision in the summer, that has already cost them a hell of a lot of money. They've presided over, frankly, an inexplicable transfer window, which the perception of that is already far worse than it was when the window closed, which was only about 4 or 5 weeks ago. And it already feels. I mean, Jamie Carragher wrote it in his piece last week, and whatever people say about Carragher, yes, he's ex-Liverpool, blah blah, but I think he's a pretty objective analyst of United, and he said it's a decision that's already cost them £200 million, and he's completely right.
Well, it was a wrong decision at the time, but the problem is now Ineos have to take ownership of that and do the right thing and move on. Because if they double down and continue to be stubborn and allow this to go, if they retain Ten Hag beyond the international break, it's just going to get worse, and they're only going to cost themselves time and money and resource, and you just can't do that. I mean, is Tuchel the right man? I've got my doubts. I think his recent record is very questionable. I actually mentioned Julian Nagelsmann the other week. I think he'd be more of an appropriate candidate. Having said that, he's obviously contracted to Germany, and the World Cup in America is coming up. Would he take the job? So there's a lot of different moving parts. Would you take Tuchel then, Samuel? Yes or no? If I had to nail your colours to a mast?
Yes, and I think I've done quite well of speaking about him for all this time without mentioning how great he would be in press conferences for us. And I know that does not remotely come into the equation for supporters. I mean, sometimes it does help. Sometimes I think supporters do. There are supporters out there who will, set their time to 10:30 on a Friday night, or search for a manager's press conference on YouTube as soon as possible, and they will lap it up to an extent. But I mean, Tuchel would be, hopefully, I'd imagine that if he were to come in, he would be as quotable as Ralf Rangnick, but with far better performances, because that's ultimately what United want. But I do think I said earlier in the year I thought Tuchel would be right for United, given the candidates or the options available to them at that point, and I'm not wavering on that. I just think for the state United are in at the moment, where they're 7 points off fourth in the Premier League table as well, and there's a risk that gap could widen. I just think that they've got to swallow their pride and go for someone who his track record would suggest he does offer a short-term fix.
A lot of fans have said to me, well, who we're going to get in as an alternative? Who is the best manager out there? And I've made the point, well, it can't get much worse than it already is. It's like,
precisely.
I know it's the Mick McCarthy video, isn't it? When it can get worse, it can, he says, the famous clip. But I don't think it can. It's the worst start to a Premier League campaign. They're 14th in the Premier League. It's just so bad. Anyone can do better than this team. Finished 8th last season. Just make a change and move on. Change has to happen. We'll leave it there for part one, and we'll actually talk about the game in the second part, because it did happen on Sunday afternoon, believe it or not. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the second part of the Manchester's Red podcast. Now it's the most exciting part of the podcast, because we get to talk about a goalless draw at Villa Park. Look, Samuel, United were tough to play against. They looked more difficult to break down, but there was clearly a trade-off there, because they offered very little attack and threat, few chances from both sides in the team. And I actually thought at half-time, I thought, if they aren't beating this Villa side when Villa are that poor, then they're never going to beat them. And I say that it's quite ironic, because they did the double over Villa last season, but obviously the teams are faring very differently this time around. Villa are still flying, United have regressed even more. It was a low-quality game, as I've said, and I guess the biggest talking point from it was Johnny Evans' performance, because he was outstanding. What a signing he's been. We've praised him to the high heavens, I think, quite a bit on this podcast. It's been remarkable seeing him come in initially to train, then signing. His contract was extended for this season, and he delivered again at Villa Park. 36 years old. What a guy.
United fans must have chanced his name about 3 or 4 times during the game, and at the full-time whistle, he was serenaded again, and deservedly so. He was by far and away the best player on the pitch, and he's got form against Claret and Blue, of course, from his first start back at United last year at Burnley. He had a really good night. He had an even better night on Boxing Day in the comeback against Villa. I think some of his best performances back at United, they've been against the best teams. Liverpool away at Anfield, that goalless draw, he played really well. United went to pot at the Etihad after he came off injured in March. It was 1-1 at that point. They'd been in front for the majority of that time as well. I mean, Graham Potter said something interesting on Match of the Day too last night when he said that it's not always necessarily about your pace; it's just about your reading and your awareness and your positioning. And of course, Evans at 36, he's not going to have a lot of pace. He's never been a particularly quick centre back, but just his positioning up against Watkins, it was completely respectful of his opponent, but it was also doing the right thing. He wasn't overly respecting Ollie Watkins. He was keeping him in check. It was the right thing to do completely by Ten Hag to take both centre backs out of the team. I certainly thought Maguire absolutely had to come in for De Ligt. I didn't necessarily think that Ten Hag would make a double change at centre back, but United didn't have as high a line. They dropped deep, and it was vindicated in that sense that they got a clean sheet. Maguire was having a pretty good afternoon until he went off injured, which was really unfortunate timing for him, getting back into the team, leaving the ground with a protective boot on. I thought his booking was ridiculous,
He's
really. It
picked up quite a
was
few injuries, hasn't he, recently? For someone who had gone such a long period without picking up
mm,
problems, there has been little niggles here and there, which is a shame because it's been at a time where you think now is his moment. When defenders are performing badly, like De Ligt and Martinez, you'd
mm.
like to see Maguire have a spell in the team and really step up.
Yeah, I was told last week that he suffered a dead leg in training, and his calf was quite sore as a consequence of that. And his calf, of course, was the problem towards the end of last season when he missed the final 4 or 5 games, and including the cup final, and it caused him to miss the European Championship as well. So he's had some particularly ill-timed injuries. He missed the Europa League final in 2021 when he got injured at Villa Park, coincidentally towards the end of that season. And his United career took a while to recover. He was fantastic for England. He was world class at the Euros that summer, but his United career didn't really get going again until maybe October last year. And it remains to be seen how long he'll be sidelined for. And in fairness, Victor Lindelof as well coming on did pretty well for his first appearance in 65 days. It's difficult. It's easy to forget that he's still at United, and it was an invidious position for him to come into the game yesterday, playing at right back as well. Of course, he's played there before, but his forte is centre back. But he performed respectably in tough circumstances. But Villa just weren't out the races. They did look like a team that had a euphoric midweek evening against one of the biggest clubs in the world, which of course they did against Bayern Munich, and they were probably still levitating from that and hadn't come down for it. And when they did come down, there was a come down of a performance from them. So that of course helped United. Ten Hag was right what he said afterwards, that it was one of the few games season where United didn't really create a standout chance of note. They were reduced to distance shots. The 2 saves from Martinez from Rashford's shots were routine. Fernandes had a really good effort that was just off target where he hit the crossbar. But they didn't really create a clear-cut chance. The only clear-cut chance in the game was right at the death with that brilliant block from Diogo Dalot. But it really was one of the worst games I've covered in a press box. There was one particularly horrendous game against Chelsea during the pandemic at home. I think both games against Chelsea in 2021 season, they ended 0-0, but the one at Old Trafford was a particularly miserable experience. It was the pandemic, it was dark, it was raining, the roof was leaking at Old Trafford, and nothing happened in the game whatsoever. And yesterday felt similar to that, which was a pity because I think a lot of us were looking forward to the game going into it, irrespective of what happened, because so much was at stake. Villa Park is a great ground, really friendly staff there as well, a real warmth to them. And then it was, the game went cold, and it just never got warm itself.
Were you warm in the press box? Most importantly, temperature-wise.
Yeah, in my new winter coat, it did
There you go.
the trick. But I did have to have my my typing gloves on in the first half.
I've made the
The
first appearance of
seasons
the season.
the seasons
Yeah,
are
winter is
changing,
coming.
definitely. Yes.
I think Dallo actually got quite lucky at the end. It was fantastic defending, a crucial intervention, because that probably was going in. But
Yeah,
you're
you would
always
say
told in
that.
football, do not turn your back. Do not, and he turned his back.
Yes,
That's
yeah.
that's how it blocked them. So that's how he blocked the ball. Hoyland, I thought, let's discuss him because he struggled to make it stick throughout the game. In those games, I think it's so important to have a striker who can take the ball, take it down, and put it on the deck and bring his teammates into play. Xerxes been praised for his build-up play. He came on, he was quite pro, and he came on, I thought, as well. But we've got two strikers there. I mean, we've banged on about this point quite a bit, but they spent 100 million on them, and they just look quite poor. To be completely honest, I still think Hoyland will be a long-term success. I think he's got all the ingredients to be a really good player. But the problem is United needed a striker for now, and Hoyland isn't for now. He's a longer-term project. Xerxes, again, look, he's got his merits and build-up play, but he's not an actual scorer, is he? And this team needs goals. They've scored 5 goals this season. 3 of them came against Southampton. And that tells you basically all you need to know. Only Southampton have scored fewer than United this season. It's just really poor again, isn't it? Attacking going forward. And I thought United should have capitalised on that yesterday. That was a huge opportunity to get 3 points because of how bad Villa were. It just never looked on.
Their goal scoring problem is a problem all of their own making, as we've stressed time and again. There was a lack of ambition, not going for Kane last year. They turned to a striker who conveniently is about to join SEG agency, the agency that represents Ten Hag, the agency that employs Ten Hag's son. This summer, the only attacking signing they make is a Dutch player who has a release clause. Apart from the release clause and his nationality, I cannot think of a reason why they signed Xerxes. I'd never watched Xerxes play for Bologna. I'd never watched him until the Euros, and he barely had a kick then. And I messaged the manager who had managed against him, and he said, slow but good link-up play, likes to drop deep, but doesn't score enough goals. So I knew what United were getting without even seeing Xerxes play properly.
He's not a bad player though, Samuel, but he fits that description to a T, doesn't he? And that's
they
the problem.
They do not need someone dropping off and
they need a
linking
goal
up play.
scorer.
They need someone who's going to score. So United were aware of this, and they still signed someone whose goal scoring record is modest at best, who has played a player who's played in 4 different countries already. What you see is what you get. I think what we see with Xerxes is the finished article. I'm not sure he's going to get better. And the only goal he has got this season was the toughest of the chances he's had. He must have had half a dozen great chances since then, and he's not taken them. When he came on yesterday, he was pretty hopeless. I'm sorry to say, it reminded me of his first half performance against Liverpool. And as I said, this is a problem of United making because they've signed 2 players, 2 strikers who are clearly backup strikers at best, and they're competing to start. And it's a form of competition that's just counterproductive because neither of them should be starters. Hoyland, as I wrote last season, his entry level was Javier Hernandez. That's where his entry level had to be. But United spent a fee that made it abundantly clear he was going to be their main striker last season. And the problem he had was that he had Anthony Marshall to offer, frankly, no support because Marshall put his feet up for the majority of the season. So it was unfair, the pressure they put on Hoyland as a 21-year-old going on 22 with a modest goal-scoring record. He just should not have been signed. If United had the finances and the skill to sign Harry Kane and Rasmus Hoyland in the same summer, and they could have justified it, fine, go ahead, do it. That would have been logical to have had Kane as the main man and Hoyland as the backup striker. But they've made a pig's ear of that. Because when the next manager comes in, he's going to see these 2 undeniably Ten Hag signings for the reasons just outlined. And he's going to say, they are not for me. You are going to have to get me in a striker who is going to score goals. Or as a compromise, I'll try and do with Xerxes what Klopp did with Firmino, which was take a striker who is not going to score enough goals, but he's going to be flanked by 2 goal-scoring wingers. So go and get me a goal-scoring winger, because we do not have one of them either, because it's not going to be Anthony. It might be Rashford, but might be isn't good enough. It could be Garnacho in 2 or 3 years, but they need someone now. It could be Ahmad in 2 or 3 years, but it's not going to be now. So I need one of them as well. And already you're talking about, for those two kinds of players, what, £150 million maybe, if they're proven. And it's, well, unfortunately, we spent all this money on these strikers last year, so you're going to have to make do with them. It's like, brilliant, great. It's a hospital pass already for whoever goes in. And I mean, Ten Hag said yesterday, he was asked outright, why don't you score goals? And his answer was just what he said last year. He said, we have Bruno who can score goals. We have Rasmus coming back, Rashford, Garnacho. He didn't actually mention.
Yeah, but why aren't they scoring goals? That is the question.
He will never answer that question. That we know. We're at the point now where we know. We'll ask Ten Hag a question. We know what he's going to say. I might as well start transcribing before he's answered it. And he said this last season, it will come, it will click. It never did come, it never did click. They ended the season on a minus goal difference in the Premier League table. And I mean, astonishingly, in their Champions League group, they did score a lot of goals, but they conceded more goals than they scored. So they didn't get that right. It's pretty abundantly clear that they needed a proven goal scorer in the summer of 2023, and they didn't get one. And from that point on, they were always going to struggle, because Ten Hag said yesterday that Højlund is just coming back. He's been injured. I take that point completely, but that performance from Højlund was reminiscent of a lot of his performances last season. It's the fitness thing doesn't come into it. When he comes off, his kit is muddied because he puts in a shift. He's knackered because he's run about. He's tried to do his utmost to make things happen. But as you use the right term, it didn't stick. He got nowhere with the ball and without the ball. And he got some stick, obviously, in the last week for his post on Instagram, which I didn't find particularly offensive. But he seems to be doing more content curating than goal scoring. He's been a better substitute striker than a starting striker since March, since he came back from that injury. And that is not good enough for Manchester United. And it's an unforgiving climate. And Ten Hag thought, when they were getting him, that Højlund had the coping mechanisms to deal with the scrutiny and the criticism that is part and parcel of playing for Manchester United. And I think he has, to an extent, but I think he can deal with it. But I'm not sure he can end up being a success in terms of scoring at least 20 goals. You probably need more than that, 25 goals season after season after season. And going back to the whole Instagram activity, he's in danger of looking more like Neil Maupay than Harry Kane.
Wonder if he plays darts then, because Neil Maupay's good at darts. I think it went under the radar how Aston Villa have actually conceded in every game until facing United this weekend.
Well, I didn't know that.
When you look at the teams they played against as well, it's some really poor teams at the bottom of the table. West Ham scored against them. Leicester scored against them. Everton scored 2. And Wolves scored 1. And Ipswich Town scored 2. These are teams that are amongst the relegation candidates and fighting at the bottom half. And yet United can't find a way, especially after Ezri Konsa goes off as well. You thought that would have given them...
Destabilised them.
Yeah, exactly. And give United a spark to go forward. And it just didn't happen. And I think you could have played another 90 minutes and United still wouldn't have scored. We'll just end on the fact that Sir Jim Ratcliffe was at the game. Samuel, he's not got a very good record, does he, when he attends games?
No,
Maybe he is the bad omen. He needs to stay away from matches. He was joined by the gang, the Ineos gang, Omar Barada, Dan Ashworth, etc. Sir Dave Brailsford was there. And they all had, understandably, very glum faces at the end. There's been a suggestion there's going to be some talks with Ten Hag this week. I think Ten Hag said that in his post-match press conference as well, didn't he? I think to you guys, am I right in saying that? He talks.
Yes.
Yeah. So, look, it seems we're going to have a decision soon. In my opinion, it does seem that this is going to continue for a few more weeks. I think, as we've just said, the right decision is to cut ties now, bring the axe down. In your opinion, what do you think is going to happen in the international break? Because that's what supporters are wanting to know.
We know what needs to happen, but I suspect they will still exercise an element of patience over it. It looks like they're at Old Trafford today. This meeting scheduled to be in London is on Tuesday. You go back to previous international break, like high-profile managerial sackings in the international break. I think Mauricio Pochettino actually fell on his sword in the second week rather than the first week. Then you have Brendan Rodgers, who I think hours after his final game in charge of Liverpool, he was informed that his time was up on the Sunday. As I think people will remember the Thierry Henry reaction on touching Jamie Carragher's thigh live on Sky Sports when they were doing their analysis of United losing at Arsenal. So I think just from the way Ineos have gone about this has been just a mess anyway. But they will still be conscious of their image and the perception of how they're going about this. But they do need to take ownership of it. I would not be surprised either way if there's a new manager in charge against Brentford next week, or whether it's still Ten Hag in charge of Brentford against next week. It's pretty clear that Ratcliffe doesn't want him to be in charge, but he's trying to maintain a structured decision-making process, and that he's the co-chairman and he's passing the buck on to the chief executive and the sporting director, who officially were not on board when the decision was taken to keep Ten Hag and extend his contract. That said, Dan Ashworth did say in the club yearbook about the decision that they took to keep Ten Hag and extend his contract. But when we spoke to Ashworth and Barada last month, they repeatedly stressed that they started in July. So officially, they've washed their hands of that decision, which should really make it easier to change manager now. And everybody knows that needs to happen. If you're of the opinion that Ten Hag should stay, I'd like to hear the reasons behind it, because they've won 3 of their first 11 games this season. They've got a minus goal difference. As you said, Southampton, the only team who have who've scored fewer goals than them. Brian Mbeumo has scored more Premier League goals than United this season. They've not scored such a few amount of goals in their first 7 league games since 1972-73. What happened midway through that season was the manager was sacked. Franco Farrell was sacked. Tommy Docherty came in.
Yeah, sorry, Sam. How depressingly predictable, I've said this, was the situation.
Yeah.
The unwanted records, they all stacked up last season, and here we are in October talking about it again, talking about these records. And we could all see it coming. How couldn't the power makers see it, the kingmakers in the boardroom? So John Ratcliffe should have done better. It is the blot on Ineos's copybook. Hopefully they'll take ownership of the decision and move on. And we can be talking about some wins and some positivity, because at the end of the day, it's better for everyone when United are performing well. We don't want to be talking about this and the managerial situation again in October. We'll leave it there. We're not even mentioned Ratcliffe's quotes on Friday. I know you briefly mentioned them, but they didn't bode well for Ten Hag, did they?
No, they didn't, which would make it even more perplexing if Ten Hag is in charge against Brentford next week. And you can't... I spoke to someone today working at a football club who said that the whole thing about 2 games to save his job, not just applying it to Ten Hag, but any manager, said it doesn't exist. They don't judge a manager on a small bank of games or 1 week's worth of games. I think it's pretty perverse if United were to look at it and say, "Oh, it's a 0-0 at Villa. It was a 3-3, gained a point late on against Porto. Let's continue to keep with him." When Solskjaer was appointed caretaker manager, that had been agreed about 8 weeks before he took over. He'd been in Manchester. Ed Woodward had lined up his duck. Mulder had even negotiated a contract with Solskjaer to ensure that they got more compensation, because I think his previous deal was due to run out, so they'd have not got a significant amount. They didn't get a significant amount anyway, but everyone was getting their ducks lined up for that decision to be made. And with the current situation going on at United, of course, they need to have a plan in place, and there is an element of patience that requires. They were caught short 3 years ago when Liverpool hammered United 5-0 at Old Trafford, because this is how badly run they were then. They literally did not have a plan to replace Solskjaer. And so they took another 4 weeks to formulate a plan as to what they would do in the event that he was going to be sacked, because they decided that he had to be sacked, but they also decided that they needed to go through the process of deciding how to go about, would they get a permanent guy in the end they got an interim in, and then they were in that weird this is how dreadfully run they were. They pretty much operated by, is this result bad enough that he should be sacked? And the final game before the November internationals, they lost 2-0 at home to City. And they decided no, because it was only 2-0 at home to City. It wasn't like it was 5-0 against Liverpool a couple of weeks earlier. But to a lot of United fans, in some way, that City game was worse because of how toothless United were in it. I think United had more shots on target at their own goal that day than they did at the City goal. It was, again, United find these spectacular ways of losing games, and that was another one of them. And so he survives November internationals, first game back, Watford away, horrendous first half. They almost look like they're going to salvage it in the second half. 2-1 down, going into added time. Watford kill the game with a third. And I remember turning to Ty at Vicarage Road and saying, we're back in this realm now of, is this result bad enough to sack him? And then it's a fourth goal that goes in, and Ty turned to me at that point and said, in answer to your question, yes. And of course, following morning, he was gone. And we knew that evening that he was going anyway. They made that decision then. But United can't operate like that. I was of the opinion last week that, well, everyone knows my view on Ten Hag anyway, but even if they'd won those 2 games last week, they should still have got rid of him. They should have got rid of him long ago. They should have got rid of him after the Tottenham game 8 days ago, but they weren't going to. That was established on the Sunday night. But it shouldn't have a bearing if two results against two decent sides in Porto and Villa away. I think a lot of people are still stuck in the past, looking at the 89-90 season, because a lot of people were harking back to that last season, that it was a dreadful league campaign, but we won the FA Cup, and then look what happened under Alex Ferguson. Times have changed drastically. It's unrecognisable in a lot of ways. Football clubs do not operate like that anymore, and United can't afford to operate remotely like that. But already they have done. Looking at them, not just this season, but the summer since the FA Cup final, really, they have operated. The way they've operated does give the impression that it's either Ed Woodward or Richard Arnold still in charge. And as I've said before, the 2 previous Manchester United managers, they were sacked in the same year that their contracts were extended. So that would be another parallel.
At least Ed Woodward could sack a manager.
He was way more decisive than these guys, which is pretty breathtaking that we're talking about.
Praise for Ed Woodward.
I know.
World's gone crazy. Thanks for your time, Samuel.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks to listeners as usual. We'll be back later in the week. Take care.